Everyone. Welcome to Crypto with English. Today's theme is going to be impact entrepreneurship. Now, this term has been thrown around a little bit. However, it might not be getting the attention it deserves, and maybe there might not be enough awareness on this subject matter as it is. But I have the solution for that today. I'd like to introduce a very special guest. Her name is Noleen Mariappen. So she is an impact entrepreneur, philanthropist, tech leader, and change maker. Now, this is this is incredible. She is effectively using tech for very benevolent, philanthropic purposes, and that is the guiding philosophy of her project. So it's not simply tech innovation for the sake of innovation or advancement in of itself. These are actually, her projects are dedicated to essentially using technology's greatest capabilities towards regions that have the greatest amount of need. So a lot of times when we have guests on, we have leaders on here, we do highlight the successes of the various projects and endeavors. Often that is very much a veneer. I think we need to have context to all of these leaders and everybody who comes on. She has an amazing origin story starting out in South Africa. And again, I'd like to warmly welcome Noleen. Thank you very much for coming on to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Adam. It's a real pleasure and an honor.
Oh, hi, Noleen. Noleen, I think your sound cut out.
Okay, here we go.
I can hear you now.
Yeah, am I back on?
You are back on.
Okay, great. Apologies. So, tech leader and the tech isn't quite figured out.
Hey, listen. It happens. So I think maybe even the technology needs its cup of coffee in the morning as well. So so tell me, before we get into some of your projects and successes,
Mhm.
let's.
Yes.
I'd like to give you some context. Tell us about your childhood growing up in South Africa, and then your eventual journey into tech and entrepreneurship, and effectively using tech for the purposes of actually addressing areas with the greatest amount of need, using technology and perhaps its best used, greatest capability purposes to deal with those needs and problems.
Yeah, sure. So, growing up for me was quite interesting, and I know we actually have at least one person who's meant to be joining, who's from South Africa, so we'll very much understand the context. So I grew up, and I was actually born during the period of apartheid in South Africa, and during that time, it was depending on your race, you were viewed differently. So you were legally a lesser person depending on the race that you were. And this had huge implications, not just in terms of how people were treated. So it wasn't just about how people socially related to each other. It was, or where you could or couldn't go. It was much deeper than that. It also impacted on the resources that schools had, for example. So if you were in schools of a different class, depending on your race, then the amount of subsidies per child differed and was less, based on the color of your skin. Of course, if you were white, you had the most amount of money, and if you were black, you had the least amount of money per child. And, schools really suffered because of this. So my experience, and this was sort of going into high school, we had computer theory classes. So we didn't actually, there was one computer for the entire school. We didn't actually get to use it at all, even though we had computer classes. We pretty much got to read about computers. And my
Right.
only experience of a computer was getting the chance to turn it on and off again. And that was in high school. And so apartheid ended just as I was about to start university, or could have. And what that meant was I was given the opportunity to apply for scholarships that I might not have been, or actually that I definitely wouldn't have been able to before. I was able to access certain grants, and I was able to get work that I wouldn't have been able to get before, which allowed for me to actually support myself, and through a large number of sacrifices from my family, that I will always, it's still just touches my heart to think of everything that my family sacrificed to allow for me to get to university. Um, and so when I was there, I was petrified of computers. And when everyone else, at that time, not everyone had their own personal computer. You had to go to the computer labs and type your assignments and that sort of thing. And I just couldn't. I was petrified of the things. I wrote my assignments for as long as it was allowed. When it wasn't allowed, I bought an electric typewriter and used that. And eventually transitioned and realized just what a big difference it made to have access, and to be able to do things, at then at such speed. I mean, now that would be considered slow, because it was still sort of dial up and that
Right.
sort of thing. But and saving things on floppy disks, which don't exist anymore. But realizing just what the potential was. And so I had this sort of intrigue and interest in the area. Was always focused on impact, wanting to have more of an positive environmental impact, positive social impact. Started my work, even though my background is organizational psychology, and I focus quite heavily on organizational development, so looking at building businesses. I really wanted to see the economic empowerment of communities, and thought that the best way to do that was through working with nonprofits. And then I realized that the nonprofit model, purely as it was, without the conscious capitalism support, wasn't quite right for me. So I tried to find some middle ground. I worked on projects that were focused on workforce development, focused on developing economically repressed areas and that sort of thing. And then moved toward business. And one of the first businesses that I launched was actually an online marketplace. And I managed to exit within 6 months.
Awesome.
And the timing was fantastic. I was really, really fortunate with it. And I try to put in practice everything that I had been learning and supporting other people with. And the time was right for it to work.
Right.
So, and did a lot thereafter with more traditional business models, and made really massively huge mistakes. And all of it was just, a learning experience. But continually saw over the years how much of an impact innovation, and particularly innovation in technology, was having in allowing for solutions, in allowing for people to be able to do more, to do things better, to have more of an impact. And so that transition sort of naturally happened, because for me, it is the space where we can have the largest amount of impact with the least amount of resource, and where we can truly, get to a point where we're solving some of the world's greatest challenges. And yeah, so, the projects that I'm involved in range massively. Think Ocean, which I'm a co-founder of, along with Hugo. He is absolutely phenomenal person, just so driven by a passion to want to end the plastic pollution crisis for the
Right.
purpose of saving ocean life. And there we're looking at technology that can be deployed in rivers, which runs off renewable energy and keeps prevents debris and waste from actually making its way to the oceans. I'm supporting Priya Giuliani, another fantastic young lady who founded IntelliAqua, which is a also a tech initiative, blockchain-based technology, which supports more sustainable aqua farming practices. Working on developing a marketplace, an NFT for impact, where we look at leveraging the power of influence. So influencers to actually be able to support the creative community, and to be able to support projects, nonprofit and community and environmental projects worldwide. And of course, building in the sustainability piece. As you'll know, NFTs and the carbon footprint has been getting quite a lot of press.
Right.
And we're looking at, the right types of partnerships, not just to offset, but to look at longer term how we continue to address this, so that the balance is always more in favor of good, and significantly more in favor of good. So much. It could
Right,
go on
right,
for
and we're
a
and we're
long
gonna
time.
right, and we're going to unpack this step by step. But I would like to touch upon your childhood growing up in
Hmm.
apartheid Africa. And the reason why is this: I think for a lot of people, this may almost seem purely academic, because I think for many it's hard to imagine that something in recent history, such as apartheid, existed. Essentially, a legal classification and division of people by ethnic group, allocating more rights to some and less to others. So, with your school having only one computer, essentially in a public school with many, many students, had to have left a very lasting impact, to say the least, which probably led you towards impact entrepreneurship, which we'll also unpack in a moment. But just to give the audience a little bit more context, could you describe the disparity of resources during apartheid between, let's say, white Afrikaners versus Native Africans and people from Southeast Asia, for instance?
Hmm. So there were different categories of people. There was white, black, which was Native African, or as people would refer to as Native African, colored, which isn't the terminology as in the US. Colored refers to people who are black, but in South Africa it's people who are mixed race, and Indian, which were everyone who is brown, irrespective of whether their ancestry was from India or not. It was just a classification.
Got it.
So, and depending on where you were on the totem pole, as it were, that was the extent of the resources. And, I speak about our school having had one computer. There were schools for people, as you've referred to, as sort of native Black African, who had no computers, where there was a shortage of books, where there was a shortage of teachers, where it was so far away from where people lived that they couldn't actually get there. And at often, and what's really might be difficult for people to comprehend is that in some places that's across Africa and across Asia, even though these aren't necessarily uh, you know imposed by legal systems as it was in South Africa, those disparities still exist. There
Right.
are kids who have to work to support their families at a young age and can't actually get to school. um, my first experience, your question about having, it having had an impact on me, yes, it did, because I always wanted to try to do more for my family and my community, because I wanted for them to be in a better situation. And for my first experience of seeing what a white school was like was, there was this very rare occasion where there was an interracial competition, and this was a math competition. and I was competing in it, and we got to go to a white school, and it was like something, and I remember it as I experienced it then,
Right.
going to the school and thinking, this is like something out of a book or out of a movie.
Right.
Because we had no point of reference. We could only go to certain places, we could go to
Right.
certain beaches, we could go to certain schools, so we never knew what was on the other side. We never knew what that was like. and
Right.
and that was my first experience of it, and and it was like something that was out of this world because it was so different.
Right.
um but we, in the realm of our existence, up until that point where the world started opening up and we started to see how other things were and start to see, and I started to travel and that sort of thing, it was a very closed experience, and you don't know what you don't know. So if you don't
Right.
have that point of comparison, you just think, okay, this is the extent of life. This just is reality, and this is just what life is like.
Right.
Um, and the more I travel, the more I realized that there were other places in the world where it was exactly the same, even if it wasn't for the same, exactly the same reasons.
Right.
So yes, that had a huge impact on me. But at the same time, there were it in a strange way, it also solidified a sense of community.
Right.
We were all of us who were in this community, we were all in the same situation. We were segregated. We had to live in a certain area. We went to certain schools. We could go to
Right.
certain beaches and that sort of thing. And we bonded because of that sameness.
Right.
And there wasn't the same um, experience of, well, some people are really rich, and so you're not friends with people who are really rich, or you're
Right.
not friends with people. So even though there were, for example, I had friends whose parents were doctors, and so they were, you know, definitely more well off than we were. It wasn't a case of, okay, well, you don't mingle with each other. It was just
Right.
that you were all kind of clubbed together and you did. And I remember for a period of time in high school where I had holes in my shoes, and my parents didn't have money to actually get me new shoes. And so while they were saving and trying to make a plan, um, we used to tape newspaper on the inside of the shoes, and use, I can't remember what the tape. It's not masking tape. Anyway, it's the kind
Like
of
duct.
plasticky
Is it
tape,
like duct
like,
tape?
yeah, like duct tape. And
Masking tape,
so
maybe.
is I don't
What
know.
color?
Is masking
What
tape the one? It's sort of
masking tape?
brownish.
Yeah, masking tape is like beige. So that's so like that might be
No,
it.
it's the one. It's the one that's kind of waterproof. Masking tape is the
Duct
one
tape
that's
then.
like
Duct tape
easy.
would be
Duct
it.
tape.
Yeah, that's
Anyway,
kind of
so that
stronger.
was it. Yeah.
Right. Right.
So that was it, and it was never an issue. None of my friends or anyone in school looked down on me because of it, or I
Right.
didn't feel like it was a big thing. I mean, of course, I wasn't putting my shoes on show for everyone to see it,
Right.
but it wasn't a big deal. And actually, interestingly, I was speaking to a friend of mine, and I might be digressing a little bit here. I was speaking to a friend of mine who's from the US, and she was talking about uh, summer holidays and spring break and
Oh,
prom and
okay.
all of that, and how
Right.
it is very much, there are certain category or groupings of people, and the popular people and the not so
Right.
popular people.
Right.
And in the same way as our experience of that now is just what we see on TV and in the movies. And she said, no, it it is like that. And she
Right.
remembers for her prom, like, her dress was crazy expensive, and her parents went all out. And I
Right.
said, my goodness, I would not have survived in the US because I would have been an outcast. Can you imagine me going to school with those shoes? That would have scarred me for life. So, in some ways, even though we had that experience, it was kind of made okay by this sense of solidarity and community and togetherness from people who were experiencing something together. But anyway, totally aside from
No, that's
what you were
wonderfully
talking
put.
about.
No, actually, this adds a lot of context and a lot of substance. And I do have one more question on your childhood in apartheid, and this is kind of to
Mhm.
further add some richness into this conversation. But growing up in that environment, and I think with what you said, there are clearly a lot of things we here in the U.S. take for granted, especially just the openness and the ease of just mobility to at least, legally, regardless of color, you can essentially move anywhere or essentially, travel anywhere. Uh, this is also in light of the numerous problems that we still have here regarding, race and culture and
Mhm.
ethnicities. And I guess you could say kind of this political machine, I think, that keeps people in places and then further aggravates these problems when economic conditions continue to get worse. But growing up in South Africa, what were the consequences, let's say, if let's say hypothetically you were to, whether intentionally or even accidentally, let's say, go to a white beach or use, let's say, a white public bathroom, or even like go to, let's say, a restaurant that's frequented mostly by white Afrikaners, for instance?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't really know what would have happened because we never tried it.
Right. I'd
I
imagine
know
it's
my
a
parents
degree of
parents
danger, to say the
definitely
least.
did. Yeah, my
Yeah.
parents definitely did. Um, but there was a fear of either being beaten or in extreme cases, perhaps the police would have been called. And by
Wow.
extreme, it's not that you would have been doing something wrong. It just depends on
Right.
on where or how exclusive the place was that you went to.
Yeah.
Um, but it was just something which wasn't allowed, and so you didn't do it because it just wasn't somewhere you went. You just went to the places that you were allowed to go to, and bearing in mind these were legal. These were written in law,
Right.
so it's not that it was just a social convention or a preference. There were legal ramifications if you didn't.
Wow.
Um, so, but it's a it's a long time it, ago, but at the same
Right.
time it isn't, and it only feels like a long time because so much has happened within the country since. But at the same time, the effects of how things were, and not just in South Africa, all across Africa,
Right.
the effects are massive. And we've been talking about technology. Access to technology is one of the things which can really leapfrog communities and economies and development.
Right.
And we see trends of places across Africa where they've managed to acquire investment and have invested in technology infrastructure and development, where they are actually leapfrogging other countries purely because of this.
Right.
And it absolutely, is the future. It is the way that we start to connect. It's the way that we connect solutions, and it's the way that facilitates innovation, which allows us to do so with a minimal amount of resource for the greatest amount of output.
Right.
But yeah, Huge advocate.
Right. No, this is and this is very, very important context. Now, in the United States, obviously, we had segregation and Jim Crow laws, and segregation effectively ending in the late 60s. However, you can see even in today's society, we are still dealing with a lot of the after effects of kind of those institutional and also perhaps less obvious and less subtle treatment of people, and how that
Mhm.
plays out, whether it's in government, whether it's in policing, and whether it's in many other things. And it's very weird because South Africa, it is in some ways a Western country, but it also has, in many ways, the most obvious, I guess you could say, ornaments of, you could say, classical colonialism. Now, the United States, the UK, and many Western countries, they've had that history, but there's also legal mechanisms that have at least pushed society forward. So there's at least a place where you can attempt to change the system, so to say.
Mhm.
You can at least participate in it. So South Africa seems very strange because it is technically, I guess, a product of, I guess you could say, colonial English and colonial Dutch cultures. And I guess you could say, in many ways, a lot of modern democracy came from that part of Western Europe. But then you look at it, it's essentially almost like a penal colony for many people, to say the very least. You have such disparate treatment and such disparate allocation of resources. And, you know, being an American, it's not an ethnicity. It's essentially a philosophy. There is no such thing as, per se, a American bloodline. Anybody can be
Mhm.
American, regardless of where you come from. And I think with some of our greatest accomplishments as a country here in the U.S., it has often involved really the talents, the creativity, and efforts of everybody. Because unless you have some sort of mechanism that provides a level playing field, not to say that everybody's going to have the same ability, but at least if everybody can participate in the game, you can really at least start unlocking the talents of a lot of people. And I think that ultimately makes a better society. So if I look at South Africa, if you're essentially keeping down Black Africans, people from South Asia, from a pure economic point of view, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot at the same time too, by not essentially allowing people equal participation and equal rights. You're effectively creating a good old boys club kind of echo chamber where essentially you're going to have the same people running things. You're never going to have any innovation. You're never going to have any new ideas. And all these other economic and class problems, they're just going to keep getting aggravated. And eventually the lid is going to blow off the top. So um, moving forward from that, could you define what impacts entrepreneurship? Now, I've heard this term, but you've been in this. So you're actually practicing this. You're putting together projects. You're launching successful projects. And I've heard a little bit of a buzz about it, but I don't think the term is as mainstream as it should be. So if you can kind of get into the weeds about that and the actual definition of it.
Yeah. So very quickly before I hop onto that, yes, absolutely, in terms of participation. And I think one of the big issues is that for such a long period of time, there was that disparity. So even though since, officially apartheid ended in the mid 90s,
Right.
it's been so difficult to get people and across the board to the point where everyone is not just given the opportunity to participate, but actually fully can. It's not just having a seat at the table; it's actually
Right.
having a voice at the table.
Right.
And I think that is going to take a great deal of time and effort. Is going to take a lot, in terms of multi-stakeholder participation, government, corporate, community, is going to take dealing with issues that face not just South Africa, but a number of countries, like corruption in government and that sort of thing,
Right.
where the focus is on people and is on development of the country for the country's good. So moving on to impact. So impact entrepreneurship is really focusing on people, planet, and profit.
The
So,
three P's.
yes, the three P's. It's not product placement and whatever the other P
Right.
is in traditional marketing. Yeah, so it's looking at, how business can essentially be a force for good, how we can work to a model which is sustainable. So sustainable, or rather self-sustaining. So, you develop, you grow, you increase profitability, and the better the company does, the better the business does,
Right.
the more potential it has to positively impact people and planet. So this is something which has, over the last few years, and I think particularly over the last year and a half, I have seen so many more entrepreneurs shift focus toward problem solving for impact. And part
Right.
of the reason for this is there's been growing publicity around the issues that are facing the planet. So, we've just come out of COP26, some disappointment about, what's been decided, what's not been decided. But ultimately, aside from that, there are such huge challenges facing the planet,
Right.
people, Earth, across the board. And one of the ways in which, purely from an economic standpoint, so if you look at business without any, even if you don't have an interest or a passion in making a difference in the world in some way other than selling your product or selling your service, the easiest way to make money is to solve a problem. We
Right.
have a phenomenal amount of problems.
Right.
So focusing on some of these social and environmental problems solves a problem and creates an opportunity to make money. But we're also, seeing generations that are very conscientious, are conscious in their buying decisions, conscious in their decisions, with regard to employment. They actually want to work with companies that have a good reputation. There's
Right.
there's so much around this that we're getting to a point where there's almost a natural transition toward social and environmental impact. All businesses essentially are going to have an element of this included, even if it's not their core business. They'll
Right.
have to be focusing on the good that's being done, and, vetting their suppliers, looking at where their products are sourced from. It's looking at the whole chain. And one of the big carrots, and at the same time sticks, is finance. Governments are using finance as an instrument to bring about this change, because people are having to report, and financial finance providers are now seeing practices which are not looking at sustainability, which are not looking at any kind of social environmental impact, and are not aware
Right.
of how they're impacting on, people and planet positively or negatively, are actually considering this as a risk. So funding is now not just about profitability. It's actually looking at whether you as a company are considered to be risky because of your practices and how it might impact on people and planet. So the impact entrepreneurship space is booming, you know, purely for economic reasons, for some, because it's an opportunity, for others, because there's a genuine passion to do better and to do more and to utilize the resources that are at hand. And also because there's a greater, it's actually easier to be able now to fund impact initiatives than it has been in the past. And it's a model that is working. It looks at becoming self-sustaining. There's research that's been done. The returns are at the same level, if not more,
Right.
than businesses and traditional businesses which focus purely on profit.
Right.
And because of the growing market for products and services and businesses which have more than just profit at heart, the businesses that do, have people and planet as part of their core purpose actually are able to scoop up more of the market, and people are actually willing to pay slightly more for products and
Right.
services where they feel like it's aligned to something positive.
That's awesome. And I think that's very, very succinctly put, to say the very least. And why do you think impact entrepreneurship is now becoming a phenomenon? And maybe, perhaps, why hasn't this been something that society has adopted earlier, maybe 20 or 30 years ago? I mean, I would like to think, whether it's towards the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 2000s, as a kid anyway, I would think like, okay, we should already be there. If you look at, those some of those cool sci-fi movies back in the day where kind of everything is, in the future, and it seems like society has moved forward a lot. You know, if I in my little kid mind, if I look at that and I kind of look at now, I'm thinking to myself, we should have had to impact entrepreneurship a long time ago. So why do you think it took so long? I guess for this for this movement, so to say, to start to take hold in industry.
Yeah. So I think that too, there are a number of reasons. I think, you know, there's sort of a hive mind mentality to some
Sure.
degree. And where the focus is purely on profit, then that's what's seen as being important. So when people think of starting up businesses, they think, okay, well, that is the way to actually become a success.
Right.
And if they focus on something else, if they want to do good, they shift toward the nonprofit sector. So
Right.
there was that kind of division. You either had to be for profit or non-profit, and
I see.
never the two shall meet.
Right.
So there was that sort of mindset, and it's only once people started to recognize that, well, businesses can be very profitable and at the same time do fantastic work and do good, that there started to be this transition. And
Right.
when you become aware that something is possible and something that can work, then you consider it as an option. But before that, if all you're exposed to is it's for profit or non-profit,
Right.
then you're going to choose from those two options. So now there's the third option.
Right.
Also, in terms of legal structures and what is recognized as a company setup, even across the US, there are businesses which, so for example, in the UK, we have social enterprises or community interest companies where you can operate for profit, and a certain percentage of your profits have to go back into community and nonprofit initiatives. And there is a legal structure for the setup of that sort of company. In the US, depending on the state that you're in, some of
Right.
them have something called for benefit, but for the most part, it's actually just the traditional kind of businesses.
Right.
So it also depends on where you are and what's recognized as the type of entity that you're able to set up in the country that you're in. And also, there's with the emergence of technology, not emergence, but this rapid growth in technology, and so many more people being able to access routes to creating solutions. There's a recognition that these solutions can both solve a problem and make money. The product is a product which is just going to generate profit, but the product itself is something that solves a problem. It's not that a percentage of the profit is going toward an initiative or anything like that. It is actually that this product or this service serves a greater purpose, but at the same time, it's highly profitable. And so with the increase, so almost exponential increase in the potential of technology to solve problems, you have more and more of this developing and growing, and there's more collaboration, not as much as there should be, because
Right.
we don't really incentivize partnerships as much as we can to be able to scale solutions, and that's something we
Right.
really need to look at. And also, governments didn't really allow for recognition of this sort of blended way of looking at things. So, for example, if you're a nonprofit, if someone donates to a nonprofit, they have it, fully as a tax write-off. For a social enterprise in the UK, if someone is to invest, they don't get the same write-off.
I see.
So,
Yeah.
so there are a number of reasons, but this focus on and also, over the last few years, there's been a greater awareness around what is happening out in the world. Some of the stories, there's so much across social media. You see things on the news, but most people actually get their information from social media,
Right.
and they get it in a more engaging way. They get it in a way which is designed to capture attention, to engage, to get people to really follow. And
Right.
once you start following and once you start engaging, you become connected. So you become
Right.
connected to certain causes, which is
Right.
very, very different to if you just see, some disaster in some part of the world on the news for 5 minutes, and after that you just get on with your life.
Right.
So it's really allowing for people to connect with and engage and start to become mobilized, toward a cause and start to take action. So I think, for a number of reasons, all of those reasons, and the fact that, all finance is becoming focused on being impact finance to some extent.
Wow. Well put. And as far as your projects, what was, I guess, among your most successful impact entrepreneurial ventures, and what were some of the successes or the experiences that you took away from that?
So I would say, among the most successful was an initiative which looked at workforce development in parallel with business development. So we looked at an economically repressed area, which there's a scale called the Index of Multiple Deprivation, which sounds, as horrifying as it is. And basically worked with businesses in that area to look at increasing profitability. So we looked at what were the ways in which they could do more. Some of them were, employing technologies. Some of them were very low tech, and to get them to the point where they could start to employ more people. So the aim was to actually develop the entire area. It wasn't just about businesses doing, better and that sort of thing. So
Right.
it was looking at all of their practices, looking at how, the collaborations, the operations, the systems, what kind of partnerships they could develop. So how they could scale and how they could scale with the right types of partnerships, the least amount of resources and make the most amount of profit, and basically expand. And then in parallel, looking at what type of skills, and what it was that they would need if they did expand. So if they were to hire more people, what would be the skills that they needed from those people? Because this is one of the big issues. Sometimes
Right.
businesses expand, but the people in local areas to them don't have the knowledge or the skills or the expertise to be able to fill the gaps. So we looked at what would be required and then worked in partnership with different training providers, different apprenticeship schemes, and that sort of thing, and looked at working with local communities to be able to to put on training programs, upskilling. And that was, it was a mixture of things. So on one hand, it was incredibly successful because we saw businesses really grow and we
Yes.
saw them increase their potential and want to hire more people. And then on the other hand, it was a flop. So
Oh,
it was a huge learning experience
right.
because what we didn't actually realize to the full extent that it was that a lot of people who were going through the training programs and upskilling were actually earning more through the benefit system in the UK
I see.
than they
Right.
would have been in some of the roles that they would have been going in on an entry level salary with the potential to earn more,
Right.
but at the starting point it wasn't. So it was a huge lesson. It was one question that wasn't asked
Right.
at
Right.
the beginning, that just did not even occur, but at the same time, for the people who did move on, who did get jobs, the businesses that did progress and grow, it was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And and the technology based projects that we have underway are set to have such phenomenal impact, and it's just super exciting. Really, really
That's
keen
awesome.
to be fully off the ground.
And it seems like one of the takeaways from this is profitability and concern and protection of the environment are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, there actually is a synergy that can be used between both those two, I guess, factors, so to say. And especially since you are in the blockchain space as well, especially with ThinkOcean, is that correct?
So ThinkOcean is not blockchain based technology. IntelliAqua is,
And Teleaqua
and
is. Right. Okay.
IntelliAqua is. The Impactoverse is going to be.
Got it. So I wanted
And
to know your. Oh,
yeah,
yes, continue.
go ahead.
So I wanted to get your opinion on this. So there has been a growing awareness of, I guess you could say, the impact or the strain of blockchain technology on the environment. So obviously, when it comes to minting, let's say in the case of Bitcoin, there is a high amount of power, electrical power, and hardware associated with those processes, and even to a lesser extent with NFTs. Minting
Mm-hmm.
and creating NFTs, that has an energy cost and a relatively high one in the scope of things, anyway. What are your thoughts on that? And what about perhaps counter arguments? So let's say if people would argue to you the impact of blockchain on the environment is exaggerated because central banks are still creating coinage and notes, which require, money, smelting of metal, all different types of complex chemical processes for that. So I wanted to know some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So I think, we, whatever it is we would like for the situation to be, we have to live in the real world. So we have to recognize that for every resource that we have, there is going to have to be an assessment of the pros and cons of utilizing that resource.
Right.
Like you say, with fiat currency, with other types of technologies, with whatever it is that we do. But the most that we can do is to start to look at how we offset those negatives, and if there are possibilities for solutions which negate those, that we're actually looking to use them. In some ways, we're confined by the limits of technology as it currently is, and also what we're the utilization of the types of resources that we have. But I think that we're going to see more and more of a shift. This has now been identified as a problem.
Right.
And once a problem is identified, it presents the opportunity for people to come up with solutions which not just solve the problem for a lot of people, but is also profitable.
Right.
So we're going to have more and more people working on these types of solutions. In terms of people who say, okay, well, no, it's not, and there's more in other places, I think, it's, for me, that's not the attitude to have. For me, it's
Right.
okay, well, this is our lane. What is it that's good and bad about what we're doing? It doesn't
Right.
matter what other people are doing.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you're, smelting your coins next door. That's
Right. Right.
yes, that's all great. But if we're doing it, we can't say, okay, well, we can continue because what's happening next door is worse. So,
Right.
we're doing slightly better. It's okay, what can we do to make it better? And in every possible situation, looking at, does the benefit outweigh the cost of doing it? Which
Sure.
is why, there are so many NFT marketplaces out there. There are so many ways of actually developing NFT portfolios. And for each one, like you say, the usage, the energy usage, the carbon footprint is quite high.
Right.
And so we've also been looking at a model which minimizes that, where we're looking at different ways of doing things. We're looking at ways of actually, utilizing tangible products that can have a digital value. We're looking at how we get underrepresented artists and communities from rural areas to be able to benefit from technology, to benefit from, the NFT boom and what is possible for them to be able to earn from.
Right.
So it's looking at how we can utilize what we have for gain, where the gain is far outweighs any potential cost, and where there is a cost, we're looking to offset it.
Right.
So the model that we're employing is that, we're aiming for carbon neutral. So we're looking at whatever that cost is, we're offsetting and working in partnership with different organizations who are already in the carbon offset space to be able to do that.
Well put. And I also agree with your point. So the argument that people may have, well, they're doing far worse harm than us. So, you know, we don't really need to do anything further. I think that's a very convenient way to avoid accountability. And I believe for any industry to really maintain their integrity and credibility, you really have to take accountability for what goes on and, take ownership and control of practices. If something can be done better, then do it by all means. So if blockchain and, let's say, crypto mining can be done in a much more healthier, environmentally friendly way, then why the hell not do it then? So, I
Exactly.
so as much as I love blockchain and cryptocurrency, I also do have healthy skepticism when it comes to certain things, as well as we all should. Even with things that we do like, even with the industry that we're
Mm.
all, respectively in, I think we should all be able to have the ability to get out of our own way, so to say, and kind of detach ourselves from our opinions and say, okay, what can I actually do better? What can actually be improved here? So I think anybody who's in the blockchain or cryptocurrency space needs to be able to keep that in mind. As much promise as cryptocurrency and blockchain technology provides, there is an environmental cost to contemplate, and there is an environmental excuse me, cost that needs to be solved as well. And speaking of blockchain, tell me more about IntelliAqua and your NFT and your blockchain projects. Tell me what you're doing and tell me what you're building.
Yeah. So IntelliAqua basically is focused on traceability. It's focused on looking at integrating data around sustainable business practices. and kind of divvying up the responsibility for that. So a number of it's the aqua farming, the aquaculture industry, and a lot of the farmers are in rural areas. They're concerned with basically survival as well, and don't really care that a couple of miles down the road there's the waste runoff water and that sort of thing. So it looks at utilizing different technologies to identify where the waste runoff is,
Right.
and places some of the responsibility on the processors, who are the ones with the money and who are the ones that are also able to influence the practices and support the practices, support the farming practices. So it allows for a great deal of traceability. It allows for us to increase sustainability practices in a more supported way, and it also looks at developing the employment, or the sector, with more women and youth who will be able to take up some of the roles that will support some of the traceability requirements. So while it's technology based, it's also looking at supporting local economies,
Right.
and building up that sector.
And
So,
oh, sorry, go
mhm.
on.
Sorry, go on. No, that's
No,
all right.
okay. I was going to ask you this. So, if let's say a group of entrepreneurs, respectively, from mid-sized, small, and startups, if they asked you, as much as I'd love to be environmentally conscious, it's just going to be too expensive for me. It's going to be too much overhead for me. What would you say to those individuals if they posited that question to you? And do you and then do you feel that maybe they're just a little too limited, or maybe not creative enough in their thinking, perhaps?
Yeah. So actually, this is something that is, faced not just with businesses, but with people generally. And when, we talk about climate change and the environment and all of that, and one of the big things to recognize is that if you are working from day to day to put food on the table 18 hours a day or whatever and still barely make it, the
Right.
last thing that you're going to be concerned about is some waste down the road, or whether you're using
Right.
plastic or whatever. Okay. It's only when society all gets to a certain level of comfort that they can start to think beyond that.
Right.
And and that level of comfort is different for different people. It's exactly the same for businesses. When businesses are in survival mode, the most important thing is just being able to pay bills, to keep the company going, to in the hope that you can get to
Right.
an even keel and then start to build and expand. But there's a transition happening. So any businesses who did say, what you suggested, I would say that their survival depends on considering these things.
Right.
And it's not necessarily, and if you don't have the money to do it, there are lots of free resources out there that allow for you to create a baseline of where you're at. And once you have that baseline, you can start to look at what practices you can improve. And some of
Right.
them are very, very straightforward. Some of them are very simple. It just means that you have to think about things slightly differently. You might need to vet your suppliers a little bit more. You might need to
Right.
think about where you're getting your goods from, where you're selling to. You might need to think about who your energy supplier is. So there are some things which can very easily be adjusted, and it's most easy to consider those things when you know where you're at, what your baseline actually
Right.
is. And there are lots of free resources out there. I mean, actually, earlier today, I sent out an email with a list of free resources for. I was speaking to a female founder group on the topic of sustainability, and it's exactly what came up. People feel overwhelmed. They know it's a big deal. Everyone's talking about, but they have no idea where to start. and they don't know whether, they can't afford to get in a sustainability consultant.
Yeah.
And that's something that I do. One of my companies is a sustainability consulting firm, but
Yes.
it's the baseline is something that you can do yourself. So it doesn't matter where you start somewhere and continue to build on it. And it's something which, will support your survival. And it's also something that will help you to leverage your business for success.
Very, very, very well said. And I always believe it's better to be preventive than reactive, so to say. So, if you're doing a practice that's eventually going to poison your own water supply, or if you're engaging in some kind of practice that's going to give you cancer 10 to 15 years, down the line, I think these are things people really need to be conscious of. And I think as far as the efficiency for business, you don't want to be doing more work per se later on, especially if it's more of kind of like cleanup or if it's more kind of unnecessary problem solving versus, maybe that energy could have been better spent in, more profitability had you, let's say, implemented some of these better practices early on. Then this would be a non-issue now, so to say. So, especially if you look at, the history of industry in the United States, you have many instances of corporations, whether they were involved in petroleum or plastic creation, dumping chemicals into, waterways and water sources and things like that. And I think for a lot of those types, it's like, well, it's not my problem now. It may not be my problem for a while, but eventually, I think rich or poor or in the middle, you're eventually going to be drinking out of that same water, and it will be your problem. So I think with the availability of free resources, I think I think it's not a huge chore or task to at least explore that in the meantime.
Absolutely.
And you know what? It's going to be less work down the line. It seems like culture, society, industry is moving in this direction regardless. And I think it's better to be first than to be playing catch up later down the line. And then you're facing all different types of scrutiny, fines, penalties, health problems, loss of money. Like these are things, maybe they don't seem like an obvious problem now, but if you sit on it, it can become monumental, catastrophic from what it looks like. And there's something significant I want to ask you. So, if you look at 2021, it seems like in many ways the service industry banking economy of the United States, Canada, and Western Europe has played a big part in the declining economy. We have essentially recessions every 3 to 4 years. We have negative interest rates and very, very little upward mobility compared to where it was 30 plus years ago. On the flip side, the third world has done a better job, let's say. And by the way, whereas in the US, let's say, the Secretary of Treasury and the IRS, they're desperately trying to regulate and, let's say, tax any type of gains or really any type or many types of operations in cryptocurrency and blockchain. Western Africa, El Salvador, people are already using cryptocurrency in their daily lives. They've effectively gone to a wireless, or I guess you could say a contactless or a cashless society, so to say. If you look at the success in El Salvador right now, adopting Bitcoin as the legal tender, and if you look at some of the success in Nigeria and Senegal and Kenya and even in South Africa, people have become much more open to integrating this into their personal life. Where hypothetically, I could actually say right now, if I was to go outside in New York City in Times Square, I could not get 9 out of 10 people to use Bitcoin, so to say. And it seems like in other parts of the world, people have been flexible and open-minded enough to actually go ahead and adopt it. And I think it's in many ways unlikely places, so to say. And from what it looks like to me is maybe you could say some of the comfort and luxury of, let's say, a banking service economy has in many ways been to our detriment now. I don't think there's much trust in banks anymore. There's really not a whole lot of trust in Washington, D.C. or Wall Street. But at the same time, too, uh, it seems like a lot of people here have not broken out of their habits. Western Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, people have picked up blockchain technology and are making the best use out of it in their daily lives. Why is that, do you think?
It's really because it provides a solution. You know, financial exclusion is a massive, massive problem globally. And it's not something that a lot of people in developed countries think about. But across the world, there are millions of people who are unbanked, who have
Right.
no access to banking, who find it very difficult to trade. Um, and I'll give you a very quick example. I was part of an event, and one of the other panelists was a professor in Dubai who was running a project in rural Pakistan using blockchain technology to help women trade animals.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and I said to her, you know, how does it work? And you know, are they not, you know, is it not too complicated? And she said, we're used to overthinking things. You know, for us, we're thinking about what's behind it, what's the technology, and all of that. All that these women care about is that they have their mobile phone, someone they trust can help them set it up very quickly, and that they can go to their local store and get the money that is due to them. You know,
Right.
when it's all said and done, that's all that they care about. And this is why, in those sorts of places and across parts of Africa and parts of Asia and elsewhere, this is what's developing and growing, you know, more of the decentralized finance, you know, looking at alternative ways of doing things, looking at things which don't require you to jump through institutional hoops because a lot of people can't.
Right.
And, you know, even now, I know people who are absolutely phenomenal at what they do. The last couple of years have dealt them a terrible hand. And because of that, you know, their banking profile has been affected. And it's now difficult for them to even open up new banking accounts for projects that they're working on.
Wow.
And you think, you know, this is absolutely ridiculous that we're in a day and age where it's not that they're asking for credit. They're not asking for
Right.
anything that's, you know, they're simply asking to be banked because they want a
Right.
new initiative to generate funds. And it's not that they can't.
Wow.
So, you know, so there are major, major issues with the traditional banking system.
Oh,
And because
absolutely.
of this, we're going to see a continued uprising for things that actually work for the people, and this is why these alternatives are really taking off.
Right. And I think the ultimate success of this is not necessarily going to be on the exchanges. It's going to be on people buying their groceries with cryptocurrency through a blockchain. It's going to be people buying their petrol and gasoline for their cars and vehicles, you know, through cryptocurrency and in a blockchain. So for me, looking at what's going on outside of the US and really examining how other areas of the world are truly adopting this, I find this extremely promising, and that's where I'm bullish, is actually people using this in their everyday lives. Because if you look at the numbers in the United States, most people who invest in Bitcoin per se, this is purely an investment vehicle. It's not really for everyday exchange and commerce, so to say. But if you look at Western Africa, you look at El Salvador, you look at Eastern Europe, people are using it for their everyday commerce. And that is where I feel it's ultimately going to succeed, is when you get the average person onto this and they're actively using this. And one of the astonishing things I feel is the fact of the matter is there's been so many examples with all the recessions, the crashes, the hyperinflation, the seemingly infinite amount of printing of currency, especially in the US. Why aren't people moving away from this faster? And I'll give you an example. So when my son was born, I wanted to go out and buy treasury bonds, and I did buy a few. but the interest rates on them were below 1%. So I kind of stopped myself one day from buying more. I'm like, why the hell am I buying this? I can buy Bitcoin on a good day and make a lot of money. And even on a bad day, this could still bounce back the next week or something like that. So for me, sitting down, these traditional vehicles of investments have really failed ultimately. Back in the day, you could buy treasury bonds for your children and grandchildren. They would be worth something after 20 or 30 years. They'd have maybe an interest rate of 10% or more. Nowadays, we have negative interest rates. And if you look at blockchain and cryptocurrency, whether it's just Bitcoin itself, or even if you stake and hold on to some of these, you get these great yearly returns of like greater than 10 or 15% for some of these. So it seems like, I don't know if it's just if it's part of the trappings of some of the first world convenience, but these trappings or conveniences may end up being kind of a dead weight to our legs, strapped to our legs if we really don't move fast enough. So, having guests like you on the show and others learning about this and exploring this, I think we owe it to ourselves here in the US to really keep an open mind and just listen and observe and perhaps talk less in some ways. Even our crypto news is mostly US centered. And by the way, that's fine. But more importantly, I really want to know what the hell else is going on elsewhere, because there is always something you can learn. And you also have to keep in mind, somebody else may know something you don't. And to reiterate my point, the ultimate success of crypto and blockchain, it's going to be held in the way average people will use it in their everyday daily commerce. It's not going to be by exchanges. It's not going to be by, I guess you can say, hedge funds that are in this. It's going to be the mom and pop small business. It's going to be the student. It's going to be the elderly couple. It's going to be the children buying ice cream at the playground. That is where you're going to see this really, really flourish. And, before we end, what do you have coming up as far as projects?
So projects coming up, I'd spoken about Think Ocean. Very excited about the NFT for Impact platform. So really looking forward to getting that up and out there. It's going to be phenomenal.
Awesome.
And does exactly that, gets everyday people to benefit, and just has huge impact. It's about NFTs that's not just for the techie lot.
Right.
Because I think that's one of the issues with cryptocurrency. There's this fear that it's so different, people don't know how to access it, how to engage with it. And when you look at, traditional banking, it's so institutionalized. So we, trying to move away from that, moving towards something that's more accessible and where people just see the value and the impact. And the Impactoverse, which is a platform that we're developing, which looks at vetting impact initiatives, matching them up with funding, and allowing for measuring and management of impact, and also incentivizing partnerships so that we can have people from all over the world with solutions working together to scale impact. So those are a couple of things in the pipeline.
That is awesome. So listen, Noleen, thank you so much for coming on today's live stream. This was very enlightening. I learned a tremendous amount, and I know the audience did as well. I'd like to have you back on in the spring. I really want to learn more about what you're doing with Impactoverse. And given the fact that blockchain is decentralized and it's unable to be altered, really, this is a good way to add transparency and to essentially keep everybody honest in the process as well. And I think we need that. Imagine if this was in either chemical processes or elections or banking. I can only imagine the amount of problems that would have been avoided for our generation, or just generations period, with a mechanism, with technology such as this. Because I think right now there's a lot of tools to kind of hide under the radar with if you have the resource, whether whether in the US or UK or anywhere else, if you have the money, if you have the influence, unfortunately, you can skirt around these things. Something like blockchain, which is immutable, you can't do that, so to say. You really can't. So having something like the Impactoverse, where you have a traceable, tangible way of observing the information and seeing what direct impact this action is having at this stage throughout the process, this is going to be a very, very time, energy, and money efficient way to pivot and make improvements and make things even more profitable. So again, Noleen, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to connecting with you in the springtime. I really want to learn more about Impactoverse, and I really think you may be onto something here. You may actually have something that's going to keep a lot of business and people honest and keep them accountable in the way they do things as well. So it's been an absolute pleasure today.
It's been wonderful being on and fantastic talking to you once again. Thanks so much, Adam. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Absolutely. Take care.
And you. Bye-bye.
Bye.